Chapter 1. The Warning at the Supermarket. Walter Green slowed his car as he turned into the parking lot of the neighborhood supermarket. The evening sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the rows of parked cars. It was one of those quiet evenings that felt calm and ordinary, the kind of evening Walter had always enjoyed. He checked the time on the dashboard clock. 6:12 p.m. Dinner at Michelle's house was at 7. Plenty of time, he muttered to himself. Walter turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, resting his hands on the steering wheel. A faint smile crossed his face as he thought about his daughter. Michelle had always loved when he brought flowers. Ever since she was a little girl, she'd been fascinated by them. On special occasions, she would run around the house, placing them in every glass jar she could find, proudly announcing she had decorated the whole place. And her favorite had always been the same: red roses. Walter stepped out of the car and adjusted his jacket as a cool breeze drifted across the lot. He walked toward the automatic doors of the supermarket, the familiar hum of shopping carts and quiet chatter growing louder as he approached. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Inside, the store smelled faintly of fresh bread and citrus cleaner. Fluorescent lights shone down on neatly organized aisles filled with shoppers finishing their evening errands. Walter grabbed a small shopping basket and headed straight toward the floral section near the front. The display of flowers was bright and colorful: yellow daisies, white lilies, pink carnations. But Walter's eyes went straight to the roses. There was a fresh bouquet of deep red roses resting in a metal bucket of water. Their petals were rich and velvety, still beaded with droplets from the store's misting system. Walter picked up the bouquet and turned it slowly in his hands. "Michelle will love these," he said quietly. He was just about to place them in his basket when he heard a voice behind him. "Walter, Walter Green." The voice sounded surprised. Walter turned around. For a moment, he didn't recognize the woman standing there in a store apron. She looked familiar, but time had changed her face, softening some features, deepening others. Then it clicked. "Linda," he said. The woman's eyes lit up. "Walter, oh my goodness, it is you." Walter laughed in surprise. "Well, I'll be Linda Warren." They hadn't seen each other in years. Back when Michelle was growing up, Linda had lived just 2 houses down from them. The kids had played together on summer evenings while the parents talked across fences and shared neighborhood gossip. "Wow," Walter said, shaking his head. "It's been, 15 years?" "Closer to 20, Linda replied with a small smile. Walter studied her more closely. She wore the supermarket's green apron and had a name tag clipped to her chest. A few strands of gray threaded through her brown hair, which was pulled into a loose ponytail. "You work here now?" Walter asked. Linda nodded. "Part-time. Keeps me busy." "Well, it's good to see you," Walter said warmly. "How have you been?" They spoke for a few minutes, catching up on small things. Linda told him she'd stayed in the neighborhood after her husband passed away. Walter mentioned he had retired 2 years earlier from his accounting firm. "And Michelle?" Linda asked. "How's she doing?" Walter's face brightened instantly. "She's doing great. Married now, you know." Linda's smile flickered slightly. "Yes, I heard about that." Walter didn't notice the hesitation. "I'm actually heading to her place right now," he said, lifting the roses slightly. "Dinner invitation." "Those are for her?" Linda asked. "Her favorite," Walter said proudly. Linda stared at the roses for a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked back at Walter. Something about her expression had changed. The friendly ease in her face seemed to tighten slightly, as if she were debating something in her mind. "Walter, can I ask you something?" she said slowly. "Of course." Linda glanced around the store. A young couple passed by pushing a cart full of groceries. Somewhere down the aisle, a child laughed loudly. Linda lowered her voice. "Your son-in-law, Brandon, right?" Walter nodded. "That's right." Linda hesitated again. "Is everything okay with them?" Walter frowned slightly. "As far as I know." "What?" Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I wasn't sure if I should say anything." Walter felt a small flicker of curiosity. "Say what?" Linda leaned a little closer. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "About a week ago, I saw Brandon here." Walter blinked. "Here? At the store?" "Yes." Walter chuckled lightly. Well, that's not a crime. Linda didn't smile. He wasn't alone. Walter's smile faded slightly. Oh, Linda looked straight into his eyes. He was with another woman. For a moment, Walter simply stared at her. I'm sure there's a simple explanation, he said carefully. That's what I thought too, Linda said quickly. At first, Walter shifted the roses in his hands. What do you mean? Linda exhaled slowly. They were very close. Walter's brow furrowed. Close. Linda nodded. They were holding hands. Walter said nothing. And laughing, she added, like they were on a date. Walter felt a faint tension form in his chest. Well, maybe she's a co-worker or something. Linda shook her head. That's what I assumed too. She leaned even closer. So I walked over to say hello. Walter raised an eyebrow. And Linda's voice grew tighter. He looked right at me and pretended he didn't know who I was. Walter blinked again. What? I said, Brandon. Hello, Linda continued. But he just stared at me like I was a stranger. That doesn't sound like him, Walter said slowly. Linda nodded grimly. That's not all. Walter felt his stomach tighten. They bought a lot of things, she said. Groceries? Linda shook her head slightly. Not just groceries. She counted them off on her fingers. A very expensive bottle of wine. Walter remained silent. Flowers. His grip on the roses tightened slightly. And a full cart of food. Linda looked at him carefully. The kind of things people buy when they're planning a romantic dinner. Walter forced a small smile. I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. Maybe, Linda said softly. She hesitated again. Then suddenly she reached forward and grabbed Walter's hand. The sudden gesture startled him. Walter, she said firmly, I wouldn't have told you this if it didn't bother me. Walter searched her face. I just thought, as Michelle's father, you should know. Walter stood there silently for several seconds. Finally, he nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. Linda released his hand. I hope I'm wrong, she said quietly. So do I, Walter replied. He placed the roses gently into his basket. After saying goodbye, he walked slowly toward the checkout line. But the cheerful mood he had walked into the store with had completely vanished. Linda's words echoed in his mind. Holding hands, laughing, pretended he didn't know me. Walter paid for the roses and stepped outside into the evening air. The sky had darkened slightly as the sun dipped closer to the horizon. He placed the flowers carefully in the passenger seat of his car. Then he sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring straight ahead. A knot slowly formed in his stomach. But he shook his head. There has to be a reasonable explanation, he murmured to himself. Still, as he started the engine and drove toward Michelle's house, the warning echoed in his mind, and the uneasy feeling refused to go away. Linda's words had planted a seed of doubt he couldn't ignore. Still, the warning left him deeply unsettled as he left the supermarket with the roses. Chapter 2. An Uncomfortable Dinner. Walter drove slowly through Michelle's quiet neighborhood, the soft glow of porch lights beginning to appear as evening settled in. The streets were calm, lined with neatly trimmed lawns and familiar houses that all seemed to share the same peaceful rhythm of suburban life. But Walter's mind wasn't peaceful. Linda's words continued to echo in his head. He was holding hands with another woman. Walter tightened his grip on the steering wheel and forced himself to exhale. There's probably a simple explanation, he murmured again, repeating the same reassurance he had given himself in the supermarket parking lot. He turned onto Michelle Street and spotted her house halfway down the block. The warm yellow light spilling from the living room windows looked inviting, just as it always had. Walter parked along the curb and turned off the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, looking at the bouquet of red roses resting on the passenger seat. Then he picked them up and stepped out of the car. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Walter walked up the front path and knocked on the door. Only a few seconds passed before the door swung open. Dak! Michelle's voice was bright with excitement. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him before he even had time to say hello. Walter smiled as he hugged her back. There's my girl, he said warmly. Michelle pulled away, her face glowing with happiness. You're right on time. Come in. Walter handed her the roses. These are for you. Michelle's eyes immediately lit up. Red roses, she said with delight. You remembered. Of course I remembered. Walter replied with a chuckle. Michelle held the flowers up to her face and inhaled their scent. They're beautiful. She disappeared briefly into the kitchen to put them in water while Walter stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The house smelled wonderful, something savory simmering on the stove. But as Walter looked around the living room, something immediately caught his attention. Mounted on the wall, directly across from the couch, was a massive television. Walter blinked. The screen had to be at least 75 inches wide. That's new, he muttered quietly. The old television Michelle had owned wasn't even half that size. Walter stepped further into the room, studying it more closely. The sleek frame, the polished stand beneath it, it clearly wasn't cheap. Michelle returned from the kitchen just then. "Do you like it?" she asked cheerfully. Walter turned. "The television?" "Yeah. Brandon got it a few weeks ago." Walter raised his eyebrows slightly. "It's impressive." Michelle laughed. "Brandon said if we're going to watch movies at home, we might as well do it properly." Walter nodded slowly. "Right." As Michelle moved past him toward the dining room, something else on the coffee table caught Walter's eye. A designer handbag. He recognized the pattern immediately. Louis Vuitton. Walter paused beside the table and picked it up gently. "Michelle," he called. She looked back from the dining room doorway. "Yes." He held up the purse. "This new too?" Michelle grinned. "Oh, isn't it gorgeous?" Walter turned the bag over in his hands. "I'm pretty sure it is." She walked over and took it from him, clearly proud of it. "Brandon surprised me with it last weekend," she said happily. Walter gave a small nod. "That was generous of him." Michelle didn't seem to notice the slight pause in his voice. "Well, you know Brandon," she said casually. "He likes spoiling me." Walter forced a polite smile, but a quiet thought crept into his mind. "I thought money was tight." Michelle had mentioned it only a few weeks earlier during one of their phone calls. Still, Walter said nothing. At that moment, footsteps sounded from the hallway. "Walter," a voice called out. Brandon appeared a second later, smiling broadly. He walked toward Walter with his usual confident stride. "Good to see you," Brandon said, extending his hand. Walter shook it firmly. "You too." Brandon looked polished as always, neatly styled hair, crisp shirt, relaxed confidence. But as Brandon reached for a glass on the counter, something on his wrist caught Walter's attention. A watch. Not just any watch. Walter leaned slightly closer. The metal gleamed under the kitchen lights, the face elegant and precise. Walter recognized the brand immediately. That watch was worth at least $2,000. Maybe more. "Nice watch," Walter said casually. Brandon glanced at his wrist and smiled. "Oh, this? Yeah. Just something I picked up recently." Walter nodded slowly. "Looks expensive." Brandon laughed lightly. "Well, maybe a little." Michelle clapped her hands suddenly. "All right, dinner is ready." She began placing plates on the dining table while Brandon opened a bottle of wine. Walter noticed the label as Brandon poured the drinks. Another expensive brand. Walter took his seat quietly as the three of them gathered around the table. The food looked wonderful: roasted chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread. Michelle had always been a good cook. "So, Dad," she said cheerfully as they began eating, "how have you been?" Walter smiled. "Keeping busy. Retirement isn't as relaxing as people think." Brandon chuckled. "I believe that." The conversation flowed easily at first: work stories, neighborhood updates, small talk. But Walter's eyes continued drifting around the room. The television, the designer purse, the watch, the wine, all expensive. Finally, he cleared his throat gently. "Michelle," he said, "I thought you mentioned money had been a little tight lately." Michelle's expression softened immediately. "It has been." Walter tilted his head slightly. "With all the medical stuff." Walter frowned. "Medical?" Michelle nodded. "Brandon's mom, Edith." Brandon sighed quietly beside her. "She's been having some health issues," Michelle explained. "Nothing life-threatening," Brandon added quickly. "But the care she needs isn't cheap." Walter listened carefully. Michelle continued. "The assisted living place raised their fees, and there have been doctor visits and medications." She looked at Brandon with sympathy. "It's been stressful." Walter nodded slowly. "That sounds difficult." Michelle hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I actually helped out a little." Walter looked up. "Oh." She shrugged lightly. I had some savings, so I gave Brandon $25,000 to help cover the medical expenses. Walter froze slightly. 25,000? Michelle nodded casually. It was just sitting in my account anyway. Brandon gave her an appreciative smile. She insisted. Walter stared at his plate for a moment, processing the information. $25,000. He slowly looked back up at Brandon. Brandon was sipping his wine calmly. Walter watched him quietly for a few seconds. Something about the situation felt off. The expensive television, the designer purse, the luxury watch. And yet Michelle had just handed over $25,000 because money was supposedly tight. Walter said nothing. He simply continued eating while observing Brandon carefully. Something about the situation felt very wrong. Chapter 3. The Argument. Dinner continued with polite conversation, but the warm atmosphere that had filled the house earlier was slowly fading. Walter tried to focus on the meal Michelle had prepared, complimenting the roasted chicken and vegetables, but his mind kept drifting back to the things he had noticed since arriving. The television, the designer purse, Brandon's watch, and the $25,000 Michelle had casually mentioned giving him. Across the table, Brandon seemed completely relaxed. He laughed easily, occasionally teasing Michelle about her cooking while taking another sip of wine. Walter watched him carefully. If Brandon was hiding something, he certainly didn't show it. Michelle reached across the table and touched Brandon's arm lightly. "Did you tell Dad about your presentation next week?" she asked. Brandon shook his head. "Not yet." He turned toward Walter. "Big meeting with a potential client. If everything goes well, it could be a huge contract." "That sounds promising," Walter said. Brandon nodded. "It's been keeping me busy." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Brandon's phone suddenly buzzed loudly on the table. All three of them glanced down at it. The screen lit up with an incoming call. Brandon frowned slightly when he saw the name. "Excuse me for a second," he said, grabbing the phone and standing up from the table. He walked a few steps away toward the living room before answering. "Hello." Walter couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but Brandon's expression changed quickly. "What?" Brandon said sharply. Michelle looked concerned. "Is everything okay?" she asked from the table. Brandon raised a hand, signaling that he needed a moment. He turned his back slightly, lowering his voice as he continued speaking. Walter watched him from across the room. Brandon paced slowly near the couch, running a hand through his hair as he listened. After about 30 seconds, Brandon ended the call and turned back toward them. His expression looked tense now. "I'm really sorry," he said quickly. "What happened?" Michelle asked. Brandon sighed. "There's a problem at work. Something with one of the client accounts." "Tonight?" Michelle asked, surprised. "Yeah. Apparently the system crashed, and they need me to check something." Walter set his fork down quietly. Brandon grabbed his jacket from a chair. "I hate to do this, Walter," he said apologetically, "but I need to head over there." Walter nodded slowly. "Work comes first." Michelle stood up and walked him to the door. "Call me when you're done," she said. Brandon kissed her lightly on the cheek. "Of course." He turned to Walter one last time. "Good seeing you." "You too," Walter replied. A moment later, the front door closed behind him. The house fell silent. Michelle returned to the table and sat down again. "Well," she said with a small shrug, "that's Brandon's job." Walter nodded. "I understand." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michelle began clearing a few dishes from a table. Walter watched her quietly. He could still hear Linda's voice in his mind. He was holding hands with another woman. Walter exhaled slowly. He didn't want to start trouble, but he also couldn't ignore what he had heard earlier. "Michelle," he said gently. She glanced up from the sink. "Yes. There's something I need to tell you." Michelle dried her hands with a towel and walked back toward the table. Her expression looked curious but relaxed. "What is it?" Walter hesitated for a moment. "I ran into someone today." "Who?" "Linda Warren." Michelle's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Linda? From the old neighborhood?" Walter nodded. "She works at the supermarket now." Michelle smiled faintly. "That's funny. I haven't seen her in years." Walter took a breath. "She mentioned something that concerned me." Michelle's smile faded slightly. "What kind of thing?" Walter chose his words carefully. "She said she saw Brandon at the store about a week ago." Michelle shrugged casually. "Okay, He wasn't alone. Michelle frowned slightly. What do you mean? Walter leaned forward. Linda said he was with another woman. The reaction was immediate. Michelle's expression hardened. What? Walter raised his hands calmly. I'm just telling you what she said. Michelle crossed her arms. That's ridiculous. Walter kept his voice gentle. She said they were holding hands. Michelle shook her head firmly. No, she also said they were laughing together, and Dad. Michelle cut him off sharply. That woman was probably Amber. Walter blinked. Amber? Brandon's co-worker, Michelle said impatiently. Walter paused. Oh, Michelle let out an annoyed sigh. They work on the same projects all the time. Sometimes they stop at the store after work if they're organizing office events. Walter studied her face. You're sure? Of course I'm sure. Walter hesitated before continuing. Linda said when she tried to greet Brandon, he pretended not to know her. Michelle threw her hands up in frustration. Oh my God. Walter sat back slightly. What? Michelle stared at him, clearly irritated now. Dad, you're seriously bringing this up based on something Linda Warren said? Walter kept his tone calm. I'm just concerned. Concerned about what? Walter hesitated. Michelle's voice grew sharper. You've never liked Brandon. That's not true, Walter replied. Yes, it is. Walter shook his head. I'm only trying to look out for you. I don't need you looking out for me, Michelle snapped. Walter stared at her in surprise. Michelle? No, she interrupted. Every time something happens, you assume the worst about him. Walter's voice grew firmer. I'm not assuming anything. I'm telling you what someone saw. And I'm telling you she's wrong. Walter sighed. Michelle, just listen for a moment. I have listened, she shouted. Her voice echoed through the room. You're always suspicious of Brandon. Walter felt a deep ache in his chest. That's not fair. Michelle shook her head angrily. You know what's not fair? Coming into my house and accusing my husband of cheating. I didn't accuse him of anything. That's exactly what you're doing. Walter rubbed his forehead, trying to remain calm. I just wanted you to be aware. I'm aware that you don't trust him, Michelle said coldly. Walter looked at his daughter helplessly. I trust you, he said quietly. Michelle didn't soften. If you trusted me, you wouldn't be standing here repeating gossip. Walter's heart sank. Michelle, Dad, please stop. Her voice was firm now. Walter remained seated. She pointed toward the front door. I think you should go. Walter stared at her. What? You heard me. Michelle, just leave it alone, she said. Walter stood slowly. I'm only trying to help. I don't need your help, she replied. Her voice trembled slightly, but her expression remained stubborn. Please go home. Walter stood there for a moment, hoping she might change her mind, but she didn't. Finally, he nodded. All right. He walked toward the front door, his chest feeling heavy. Behind him, Michelle said nothing. Walter opened the door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him immediately. He paused on the porch for a moment before walking toward his car. His heart felt heavier with every step. He had only wanted to protect his daughter, but now he understood something clearly. Michelle loved Brandon too much to believe anything negative about him. Walter started the car and slowly drove away from the house. The streetlights blurred slightly as he stared ahead at the empty road. A painful realization settled in his mind. Michelle would never believe him without proof. Walter leaves heartbroken, realizing that Michelle will never believe him without proof. Chapter 4. The Private Investigator. Walter barely slept that night. After leaving Michelle's house, he had driven home slowly, replaying the argument again and again in his mind. The image of Michelle, standing in the doorway with anger in her eyes, refused to leave him. He had only wanted to protect her. Instead, he had been thrown out of her house like an enemy. Walter lay awake in bed long after midnight, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, Linda's voice returned. He was holding hands with another woman. Then Michelle's voice followed. That was probably Amber. Walter turned onto his side and sighed heavily. There were too many things that didn't add up. The expensive television, the Louis Vuitton purse, the luxury watch, and $25,000 supposedly spent on medical care. Walter had spent 40 years working as an accountant. Numbers and patterns had always made sense to him. When something didn't add up, it usually meant someone was hiding something. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, Walter had already made up his mind. He couldn't ignore this anymore. If Brandon was lying to Michelle, Walter needed to know. Not rumors. Not guesses. Facts. Walter sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop open in front of him. He typed slowly into the search bar. Private investigator near me. Several results appeared immediately. Walter scanned through the list carefully. Some websites looked cheap and unprofessional. Others seemed too flashy. One name kept appearing in multiple reviews. Marcus Reeves, Private Investigations. Walter clicked the link. The website was simple and direct. No exaggerated promises. No dramatic headlines. Just straightforward information about surveillance services, background investigations, and marital infidelity cases. Walter leaned back slightly. This looked legitimate. He stared at the phone number on the screen for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a calm voice answered. Reeves Investigations. Walter cleared his throat. Hello, my name is Walter Green. I'd like to speak with Marcus Reeves. You're speaking to him. Walter paused briefly. Mr. Reeves, I think I might need your help. There was a short silence on the line. What kind of help? Marcus asked. Walter hesitated. It's about my son-in-law. Marcus's tone remained professional. Why don't we meet in person? It's easier to discuss these things face-to-face. Walter agreed. They arranged to meet later that afternoon at Marcus's office downtown. The office building was modest, but well-maintained. Walter stepped inside and followed the directory signs until he reached a small office suite on the second floor. The name Marcus Reeves Investigations was printed neatly on the door. Walter knocked. Come in. Walter opened the door. The office inside was tidy and organized. Shelves filled with neatly labeled folders lined one wall. A desk sat near the window, and behind it stood a tall man in his mid-40s. Marcus Reeves looked exactly like someone you would expect a private investigator to look like. Sharp eyes, calm posture, observant. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Mr. Green. Walter shook it. Thank you for meeting with me. Please have a seat. Walter sat down across from the desk. Marcus remained standing for a moment, studying him quietly before sitting down as well. So, Marcus said, folding his hands, tell me what's going on. Walter took a deep breath. It's about my daughter's husband. Marcus nodded slightly. Go on. Walter began explaining everything. He told Marcus about the encounter with Linda at the supermarket, about her seeing Brandon with another woman, about the expensive purchases he noticed during dinner, about Michelle giving Brandon $25,000, and finally about the argument that had ended with Michelle forcing him to leave. Marcus listened without interrupting. Occasionally, he jotted down a note on a small pad. When Walter finished, the room fell silent for a moment. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. What's the husband's name? He asked. Brandon. Last name, Hayes. Marcus wrote it down. And the co-worker? Amber, Walter said. Amber Wright. Marcus tapped his pen thoughtfully. You believe they're having an affair. Walter sighed. I don't want to believe it. But something feels wrong. Marcus nodded. That feeling is usually what brings people to my office. Walter looked up. I don't want to destroy my daughter's marriage, he said quietly. But if he's lying to her, she deserves to know. Marcus closed his notebook. I understand. Walter leaned forward slightly. Can you investigate it? Marcus gave a small nod. Yes. Walter exhaled. But we do it quietly, Marcus added. No confrontations. No accusations. Just observation. That's exactly what I want. Marcus stood up. I'll start with basic surveillance. Workplace, routine movements, social contacts. Walter rose as well. How long will it take? Marcus shrugged lightly. Depends on what he's doing. Walter understood. If Brandon was innocent, the investigation would find nothing. But if he wasn't, Marcus extended his hand again. I'll be in touch. Walter shook it firmly. Thank you. 3 days passed. Walter tried to distract himself with small tasks around the house, but his thoughts kept returning to Marcus's investigation. Each time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped slightly. On the fourth afternoon, the call finally came. Mr. Green, Marcus said calmly on the phone. Yes, I have some updates. Walter sat down slowly. What did you find? Marcus paused briefly. Well, The good news is the surveillance was very easy. Walter's stomach tightened. And the bad news? Marcus spoke carefully. Your son-in-law is definitely seeing someone. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Amber? Yes. Marcus continued. I've been following him for the last few days. And they meet frequently. Walter swallowed. How frequently? Marcus didn't hesitate. Almost every day. Walter stared at the floor. Marcus continued speaking. And it's not just casual meetings. Walter forced himself to ask the question. What do you mean? Marcus's voice remained calm and factual. They behave like a couple. Walter said nothing. I've taken photographs, Marcus continued, and recorded video as well. Walter rubbed his forehead slowly. How long? Marcus checked his notes. For what I've gathered, this relationship didn't start recently. Walter's heart pounded. How long has it been going on? Marcus answered quietly. Over a year. Walter felt the room spin slightly. A year. Yes. Marcus continued. They go to restaurants together, shopping centers, parks. They hold hands. Kiss in public. Walter remained silent. I'm sending you some files now, Marcus said. Walter's phone buzzed a moment later. He looked down at the screen. Several photos had appeared. With trembling fingers, Walter opened the first one. Brandon and a blonde woman sat at an outdoor cafe. They were smiling. Brandon's hand rested on hers. Walter opened the second photo. They were walking through a shopping center, holding hands. The third image showed them standing close together outside a restaurant. Amber was laughing. Brandon leaned in and kissed her. Walter slowly lowered the phone. His chest felt tight. Marcus's voice came through the speaker again. There's also video. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. The evidence was clear. There was no misunderstanding. No innocent explanation. His worst fears were no longer fears. They were reality. Walter sat in silence as the weight of the truth settled over him. Marcus sends Walter photos and videos showing them together in public. Walter feels his worst fears slowly becoming reality. Chapter 5, The Affair Revealed. Walter sat at his kitchen table long after the call with Marcus Rees had ended, staring at the photographs on his phone. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, untouched. For several minutes, he simply sat there, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Brandon and another woman, laughing, holding hands, kissing. Walter slowly placed the phone down on the table and rubbed his eyes. Maybe it's not what it looks like, he whispered to himself, though the words sounded weak even as he said them. The pictures were clear, too clear. Brandon's arm around the woman's shoulders. Her head tilted toward him as they laughed together outside a restaurant. There was nothing friendly about the way they looked at each other. Walter sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. His thoughts immediately turned to Michelle. If she could see these photos, he stopped himself. No, not yet. He needed to understand everything first. The phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message from Marcus. More updates coming today. Walter typed back quickly. Thank you. He set the phone aside and tried to distract himself by washing the dishes in the sink. But every few minutes his eyes drifted back to the table, waiting for the phone to light up again. 2 hours later, it finally did. The screen displayed Marcus's name. Walter answered immediately. Hello, Mr. Green, Marcus said calmly. I have additional information. Walter sat down again. What did you find? Marcus spoke in the same steady tone he always used. I continued surveillance today. And they met again. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Where? A restaurant downtown. Walter nodded slowly. Marcus continued. I followed them after Brandon left his office. Amber was already waiting. Walter listened carefully. They greeted each other with a hug, Marcus said. Then they walked inside together. Walter stared at the table as he imagined the scene. What happened next? He asked quietly. They had dinner, sat close together, shared a bottle of wine. Marcus paused briefly. I also took more photographs. Walter's phone buzzed again as the images arrived. He opened them reluctantly. The first photo showed Brandon and Amber sitting at a candlelit table. Brandon was leaning forward, smiling at her as she spoke. The second photo was taken outside the restaurant. Amber stood near the entrance while Brandon gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Walter's chest tightened. The third image was even worse. Brandon was kissing her. Not a quick, friendly peck. A long, intimate kiss. Walter swallowed hard and locked his phone screen. There was no denying it anymore. They behaved like a couple, Marcus said. Walter nodded silently, though Marcus couldn't see him. I'm sorry, Marcus added. Walter sighed. Just tell me everything you find. I will. For the next few days, Marcus continued his investigation. Every evening, Walter received new updates. New photos. New videos. New proof. One video showed Brandon and Amber walking slowly through a shopping center, their fingers intertwined. Another clip showed them sitting on a bench in a park, laughing as Amber rested her head on Brandon's shoulder. Walter watched each piece of evidence with a growing sense of dread. The more he saw, the clearer the truth became. This wasn't a recent mistake. It wasn't a brief moment of weakness. Brandon and Amber had built a relationship. A real one. Days later, Marcus called again. This part of the investigation uncovered something else, he said. Walter immediately felt uneasy. What is it? Marcus spoke carefully. I've been reviewing Brandon's financial activity. Walter frowned. What about it? Specifically the credit cards he uses. Walter leaned forward slightly. And Marcus paused. One of the cards appears to be a joint account. Walter's brow furrowed. Joint with who? With your daughter. Walter's stomach tightened. Michelle. Yes. Walter suddenly felt cold. What does that have to do with Amber? Marcus didn't hesitate. He's using that card to pay for their outings. Walter sat up straight. What? Marcus continued calmly. I've been tracking the transactions tied to the restaurants and stores they visit. Walter gripped the edge of the table. And they match. Yes. Walter's heart began to pound. You're telling me Brandon is using Michelle's credit card to take another woman out? That's correct. Walter felt anger rising in his chest. Marcus continued explaining. Over the past several months, the charges have added up significantly. Walter spoke slowly. How much? Marcus checked his records. Just over $11,000. Walter stared at the wall in disbelief. 11,000? Yes. Marcus continued listing the expenses. High-end restaurants, designer stores, jewelry. Walter rubbed his temples. Jewelry, yes. Marcus sent another file. Walter opened it. The document showed several purchase records. His eyes immediately caught one entry. Diamond necklace, $3,847. Walter blinked slowly. What is that? He asked quietly. Marcus answered. A necklace Brandon purchased at a jewelry boutique 3 weeks ago. Walter stared at the number. $3,847. For Amber? He asked. Yes. Walter's jaw tightened. Marcus continued. There are also multiple shopping trips. Walter scrolled through the records. Designer clothing stores, luxury restaurants, wine bars, boutiques. Each receipt carried the same card number. Michelle's card. Walter leaned back in his chair, stunned. He remembered Michelle proudly showing him the Louis Vuitton purse. Brandon surprised me with it. Walter felt a cold realization creep over him. If Brandon was buying luxury gifts for Amber, then where had Michelle's purse come from? Walter shook his head slowly. Marcus spoke again. There's enough evidence now to establish a pattern. Walter didn't answer. Your son-in-law isn't just seeing Amber occasionally, Marcus said. He's maintaining an entire relationship. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he set the phone down on the table. He stared at the financial report again. $11,000. Spent on another woman. And every dollar came from an account shared with Michelle. His daughter had trusted Brandon completely. Trusted him with her money. Trusted him with her life. Walter closed his eyes. The betrayal felt deeper than he had imagined. This wasn't just an affair. It was deception layered on top of deception. Brandon wasn't only cheating. He was stealing. Walter opened his eyes again and stared at the report one last time. A painful truth settled heavily in his chest. Brandon was not only betraying Michelle's heart. He was using her own money to do it. Walter realizes Brandon is not only cheating. He is using Michelle's money to fund the affair. Chapter 6. The Missing $25,000. Walter sat at his desk, staring at the stack of documents Marcus had sent in the night before. The financial records were spread across the table, each page carefully organized. Restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, designer store receipts. Each charge told the same story. Brandon had spent thousands of dollars on Amber. Walter rubbed his forehead slowly. $11,000 already accounted for. And those were just the transactions Marcus had managed to track so far. But something else continued bothering him even more. The $25,000 Michelle had mentioned during dinner. Walter leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. I gave Brandon $25,000 to help with his mom's medical care. Michelle had said it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Walter stood up and walked slowly to the kitchen, pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee. But the warmth of the drink did little to calm the growing unease inside him. If Brandon was spending money on restaurants, jewelry, and luxury trips, then where had that $25,000 actually gone? Walter returned to the table and picked up his phone. He dialed Marcus. The investigator answered after the second ring. Reeves Investigations. Marcus, it's Walter. Good morning, Mr. Green. Walter took a deep breath. There's something else I want you to check. Go ahead. The $25,000 my daughter gave Brandon. Marcus paused. The money for his mother's medical expenses? Yes. Walter's voice grew more serious. I want to know if that money actually went to his mother. Marcus didn't respond immediately. I'll look into it, he finally said. Thank you. Walter hung up, hoping the investigation would prove his suspicions wrong. But deep down, a quiet voice told him that wasn't likely. 2 days later, Marcus called again. Walter answered immediately. Did you find anything? Marcus's tone sounded thoughtful. Yes. Walter sat down slowly. What did you discover? Marcus spoke carefully. I located Brandon's mother. Walter felt a slight wave of relief. And she's living in an assisted living facility. That sounds normal, Walter said. Marcus continued. But it's not the kind of place that requires large medical payments. Walter frowned. What do you mean? It's a modest facility. Basic services. Nothing high-end. Walter leaned forward. Are you sure? Yes. Walter thought about Michelle's explanation again. Medical bills have been really expensive. The numbers didn't match. How much does the facility cost? Walter asked. About $1,800 a month. Walter did the math quickly in his head. That was nowhere near $25,000. Does she receive medical treatments? Walter asked. Nothing significant that I could find. Walter remained silent for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind. Marcus, did she ever receive the money? Marcus answered honestly. I couldn't find any record of that. Walter's stomach tightened. I think you should speak to her directly, Marcus said. Walter hesitated. You mean visit her? Yes. Walter stared at the wall. Part of him didn't want to go, but another part knew he had to. I'll go tomorrow, he said quietly. The assisted living facility sat on a quiet street several miles outside the city. It was clean but simple, nothing like the expensive retirement communities Walter had seen advertised on television. Walter parked his car and stepped out slowly, studying the small brick building. The front garden contained a few benches and flower beds, but the place had a quiet, modest atmosphere. He walked inside. The reception desk sat near the entrance, where a middle-aged woman greeted him politely. Good morning. Walter smiled politely. Good morning. I'm here to see Edith Hayes. The woman checked a list. She's in room 214. Walter nodded. Thank you. He took the elevator to the second floor. The hallway was quiet. Soft music played somewhere in the distance as he walked past several closed doors. Finally, he stopped in front of room 214. Walter knocked gently. A soft voice answered. Come in. Walter opened the door slowly. Inside, an elderly woman sat in a comfortable chair near the window, knitting quietly. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and a pair of reading glasses rested low on her nose. She looked up as Walter entered. Yes. Walter stepped inside. Mrs. Hayes. She nodded. That's me. Walter smiled politely. My name is Walter Green. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Green. Walter hesitated before explaining. I'm Michelle's father. Edith's expression brightened immediately. Oh, Michelle's father. Walter nodded. She's such a sweet girl, Edith said warmly. Walter felt a small pang of sadness. Yes, she is. Edith gestured toward a chair. Please sit. Walter sat down across from her. I hope you don't mind my visiting, he said. Not at all, Edith replied kindly. It's nice to have company. Walter glanced around the small room. It was tidy but simple. A small bed, a dresser, a television that looked at least 10 years old. Nothing about the place suggested expensive medical care. Edith set her knitting aside. How is Michelle doing? She asked. She's doing well, Walter replied. That's good to hear. Walter hesitated before speaking again. I actually wanted to ask you something. Edith nodded. Of course. Walter chose his words carefully. Michelle mentioned that Brandon has been helping you with medical expenses. Edith looked confused. Medical expenses? Walter nodded slowly. Yes. Edith shook her head gently. I don't really have any. Walter blinked. What about your assisted living payments? Oh, those? Edith said casually. I handle those myself. Walter frowned. You do? Yes. With my Social Security. Walter felt a chill run down his spine. You don't receive financial help from Brandon? Edith hesitated. Well, not really. Walter leaned forward slightly. Michelle told me she gave Brandon $25,000 to help pay for your care. Edith stared at him in surprise. She did what? Walter's heart sank. She gave him the money for your medical expenses. Edith shook her head slowly. Oh my goodness. Walter's voice grew quieter. You never received it? No, Edith said firmly. I've never seen a penny of that. Walter sat back in the chair, stunned. Edith continued speaking. I pay my bills every month myself. Walter struggled to process what he was hearing. Does Brandon visit often? He asked. Edith looked down at her hands. Not really. How often? She sighed softly. Maybe once every few months. Walter frowned. He told Michelle he's here all the time. Edith shook her head again. No, a heavy silence filled the room. After a moment, Edith spoke again. There's something else. Walter looked up. What is it? Edith hesitated before answering. Brandon asked me not to answer Michelle's phone calls. Walter felt his chest tighten. What? He said she worries too much. Edith explained quietly. He told me it would be better if he handled things himself. Walter's hands slowly clenched into fists. Everything suddenly made sense. The money, the lies, the excuses. Walter stood slowly. Thank you for telling me the truth, he said. Edith looked concerned. Is everything all right? Walter forced a polite smile. Yes, but inside his heart felt heavy. As he walked back down the hallway toward the elevator, the truth became painfully clear. Michelle had trusted Brandon with her savings, trusted him to take care of his mother. But the money had never reached Edith. Walter stepped outside the building and stood beside his car, staring into the distance. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. Brandon hadn't just lied. He hadn't just cheated. He had stolen from his own wife. Walter closed his eyes slowly. The truth was undeniable now. Brandon had taken Michelle's $25,000 and used it for something else. Brandon stole Michelle's money. Chapter 7, The Aspen Lie. Walter sat quietly in his living room as the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. The house felt unusually silent, the kind of silence that made his thoughts louder than usual. On the coffee table in front of him sat a thick folder Marcus had delivered earlier that day. Walter had not opened it yet. For several minutes, he simply stared at it, knowing that whatever was inside would likely make the situation even worse. The truth had already been painful enough. Brandon was cheating on Michelle. He was spending thousands of dollars from their shared account on another woman. And the $25,000 Michelle had given him for his mother had never reached Edith. Walter rubbed his tired eyes. How much worse can it get? He muttered to himself. As if on cue, his phone rang. Marcus. Walter picked it up immediately. Hello. Mr. Green, Marcus said calmly. I've uncovered something else. Walter leaned back in his chair. I had a feeling you would. Marcus paused briefly. This one's a little bigger. Walter sighed. Go ahead. Marcus began explaining. I continued reviewing Brandon's financial records and travel history. Walter listened carefully. And there was a trip about 3 months ago. Walter frowned slightly. What kind of trip? A 4-day getaway. Walter's heart sank slightly. Business or personal? Marcus answered. That's where things get interesting. Walter sat forward now, his attention fully focused. What did Brandon say the trip was for? Marcus flipped through some papers on his end. According to his calendar and work schedule, he told people he was attending a conference. Walter nodded slowly. Where? San Diego. Walter felt a small sense of recognition. Michelle had mentioned that trip during a phone call weeks ago. He remembered it clearly. Brandon's at a conference in San Diego. He'll be back Sunday. Walter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That sounds right. Marcus's voice remained steady. The problem is, that's not where he went. Walter's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Marcus continued. I checked airline records, hotel bookings, and credit card transactions. Walter waited. Brandon never flew to San Diego. A quiet tension filled the room. Then where did he go? Walter asked slowly. Marcus answered. Aspen. Walter blinked. Aspen? Yes. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. Aspen wasn't exactly a cheap conference destination. What was he doing there? Walter asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. He wasn't alone. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Amber? Yes. Walter leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're sure? I'm positive. Marcus continued explaining. I found the flight records first. 2 tickets booked under different names, but purchased together. Walter listened carefully. Then I found the hotel reservation. What hotel? A luxury resort in Aspen. Walter let out a slow breath. How long did they stay? 4 nights. Walter shook his head slowly. That's not a conference. No, it's not. Marcus sent several documents to Walter's phone. They checked in on a Thursday evening, Marcus continued, and checked out Monday morning. Walter opened the files. The first document was a copy of a hotel invoice. The price made his eyebrows rise. Good Lord, he whispered. The resort cost nearly $800 per night. He scrolled further. There were additional charges listed below. Spa services, room service, private dining. Walter's jaw tightened. Marcus continued calmly. There are also restaurant receipts. Walter opened another file. More charges appeared. Steakhouses, wine bars, Mountain View restaurants. Each receipt carried the same familiar credit card number. Michelle's card. Walter clenched his jaw. How much did he spend? He asked quietly. Marcus checked his notes. Between flights, hotel, dining, and other expenses, around $6,000. Walter leaned back in his chair. $6,000. For a romantic vacation. With another woman. Marcus continued. There's also photographic confirmation. Walter felt his stomach twist. Photos. Yes. Another message arrived on his phone. Walter hesitated before opening it. The image showed Brandon and Amber standing on a snow-covered balcony. Mountains stretched across the background behind them. Amber wore a thick winter coat and sunglasses, smiling brightly at the camera. Brandon stood beside her with his arm around her waist. They looked like a couple enjoying a romantic ski vacation. Walter lowered the phone slowly. This is unbelievable, he muttered. Marcus spoke again. The important part is this. Brandon told Michelle he was in San Diego. Walter nodded slowly. Yes, she mentioned that. Marcus's voice became more serious. You might want to confirm that. Walter thought for a moment. Then he said, I will. That evening, Walter called Michelle. The phone rang twice before she answered. Hi, Dad. Her voice sounded cautious, but not hostile like the night of their argument. Hi, sweetheart, Walter replied gently. How are you? I'm good, she said. How about you? Walter smiled faintly. I'm all right. They spoke casually for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather. Michelle's work. A neighbor Walter had run into earlier that week. Walter waited patiently for the right moment. Finally, he spoke again. Hey, I was just thinking about something. What? That conference Brandon went to a while back. Michelle sounded confused. Which one? The one in San Diego. Oh, that one, she said casually. Walter kept his tone light. How was it? Pretty good, I think. You think? Well, I wasn't there, she laughed. Walter chuckled softly. Right? Michelle continued. He said the meetings went well. Walter leaned back in his chair. How long was he there? For days, Michelle replied immediately. Thursday to Monday. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Exactly the same dates Marcus had mentioned. Did he say anything interesting about the trip? Walter asked. Not really, Michelle said. Just work stuff. Walter nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see him. Well, that's good. Why are you asking? Michelle said curiously. Oh, no reason, Walter replied quickly. I was just thinking about traveling again myself someday. Michelle laughed lightly. Well, if you go to San Diego, you'll have to tell Brandon. Walter forced a small smile. Maybe I will. They spoke for a few more minutes before ending the call. Walter set the phone down on the table. The room felt colder now. Michelle believed every word Brandon had told her. San Diego. Work conference. 4 days of meetings. But Walter now knew the truth. Brandon hadn't been in San Diego. He had been thousands of miles away in Aspen, on a luxury vacation, with Amber. Walter stared out the window as darkness slowly settled over the neighborhood. Each new discovery made the situation clearer. The lies were bigger than he had imagined. Much bigger. Walter now knows Brandon's lies are even bigger than he imagined. Chapter 8. Brandon's Double Life. The evidence Marcus had gathered over the past 2 weeks filled nearly an entire folder now. Walter sat at his dining table one morning, flipping slowly through the documents. Photos of Brandon and Amber. Restaurant receipts. Hotel bookings. Credit card statements. The Aspen trip. The missing $25,000. Every page told the same story. Brandon Hayes was not the man Michelle believed he was. Walter leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. But one thought continued nagging at him. Something still didn't quite make sense. Brandon had been careful, very careful. The lies were layered and organized. The secret relationship with Amber had been hidden for over a year. That kind of deception required planning, which made Walter wonder about one more thing. What exactly did Brandon's coworkers know? Walter closed the folder and tapped his fingers lightly on the table. If Brandon was spending so much time with Amber, if they were openly acting like a couple in public places, then how did he explain Michelle? Did the people at his office know he was married? Or had Brandon created an entirely different story there too? Walter reached for his phone and dialed Marcus. The investigator answered almost immediately. Mr. Green. Marcus, I have another question. Go ahead. Walter hesitated for a moment. What do Brandon's co-workers think about him? Marcus paused. I'm not sure, he admitted. My surveillance focused mostly on his movements outside work. Walter nodded slowly. That's what I thought. You could always ask them. Walter raised an eyebrow. Ow! Marcus chuckled softly. People talk more than they realize, especially around potential clients. Walter understood the suggestion immediately. Pretend I'm interested in doing business with a company? Exactly. Walter leaned back in his chair, thinking it over. Worth a try, he said. The following afternoon, Walter drove downtown to the office building where Brandon worked. The structure was tall and modern, with large glass windows reflecting the bright sunlight. Employees moved in and out of the lobby carrying laptops, briefcases, and coffee cups. Walter adjusted his jacket and stepped inside. The lobby was spacious and quiet. A reception desk stood near the elevators. Walter approached the desk, where a young woman sat typing on a computer. She looked up and smiled politely. Good afternoon. Can I help you? Walter returned the smile. Yes, I'm here to speak with someone about potential consulting services. Do you have an appointment? No, Walter said calmly. I was hoping to speak with someone about your client services department. The receptionist nodded. Let me see who's available. She picked up the phone and made a quick call. After a brief conversation, she hung up and looked back at Walter. Someone from the team will meet with you shortly. Thank you. Walter took a seat in the waiting area. A few minutes later, a man in his early 30s approached him with a friendly expression. Mr. Green, Walter said, standing to shake his hand. Nice to meet you, Mr. Green. I'm Daniel. They shook hands. I understand you're interested in discussing potential services. Walter nodded. Yes, I'm exploring options for a possible business project. Daniel gestured toward a nearby conference room. Let's talk. Inside the room, they sat across from each other at a large table. Daniel began explaining the company's services, but Walter only half listened. Instead, he used the opportunity to ask casual questions about the office. How long have you worked here? Walter asked. About 4 years. Do you enjoy it? Most of the time, Daniel laughed. Walter smiled politely. Seems like a good team here. It is. Walter leaned back slightly. Who will be managing my account if I signed on? Daniel thought for a moment. Depend on the project. But one of our senior account managers would probably handle it. Anyone you'd recommend? Daniel shrugged casually. Well, Brandon Hayes is one of our strongest guys. Walter pretended to consider the name. Brandon Hayes? Yeah, smart guy. Clients love him. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Is he available? Daniel checked his watch. He's actually out for lunch right now. Walter pretended to look disappointed. That's too bad. Daniel smiled. He'll be back soon, though. Walter hesitated before asking his next question. Is he married? Daniel looked surprised. Brandon? Yes. Daniel laughed. No way. Walter tilted his head. Really? Daniel shook his head. He's definitely single. Walter kept his expression neutral. I could have sworn I heard otherwise. Daniel chuckled. No. He leaned back in his chair. If Brandon was married, we'd all know about it. Walter nodded slowly. I see. Daniel continued casually. Honestly, he's practically dating someone here already. Walter's attention sharpened. Oh, Amber. Walter kept his voice calm. Amber. Amber Wright. Daniel smiled knowingly. Everyone knows about them. Walter felt a chill run through his chest. They're close? He asked carefully. Daniel laughed. That's one way to put it. He leaned forward slightly. They go to lunch together all the time. Leave work together most evenings. Walter nodded slowly. They sound like a couple. Daniel shrugged. Pretty much. Walter asked casually, how long has that been going on? Daniel thought for a moment. At least a year. Walter remained silent. Daniel continued chatting comfortably, unaware of the storm building inside Walter's mind. Honestly, I'm surprised they haven't made it official yet. Walter raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Daniel grinned. You know, boyfriend and girlfriend. Walter forced a small smile. Right. Daniel stood up after finishing his explanation about the company's services. Well, if you decide to move forward, Brandon would probably be the best person to handle your account. Walter rose from his chair. I'll think about it. They shook hands. Thanks for coming in, Mr. Green. Walter walked out of the conference room and back toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind him, he exhaled slowly. The truth was worse than he had imagined. At home, Brandon played the role of a devoted husband. At work, he was something else entirely. A single man. A man dating Amber Wright. A man with no wife. No one at the office had ever heard the name Michelle. Walter stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, feeling the weight of the discovery settle heavily in his chest. Brandon hadn't just been hiding an affair. He had built an entirely separate identity. 2 lives. 2 stories. 2 realities. And Michelle knew nothing about any of it. Walter walked slowly to his car, his thoughts racing. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. Brandon Hayes had been living 2 completely different lives. And now Walter understood just how deep the deception really went. Walter realizes his son-in-law has been living 2 completely separate lives. Chapter 9. Preparing the Truth. Walter sat at his desk, the soft hum of the ceiling fan filling the otherwise quiet study. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the room, but Walter hardly noticed it. His attention was entirely on the stack of documents in front of him, which Marcus Reeves had just delivered. The thick envelope had been heavy in his hands when he picked it up, and now, as he opened it, the contents spilled across the table like a dam breaking. Photographs, videos, printed receipts, travel itineraries, credit card statements, and even handwritten witness notes, all meticulously documented by Marcus. Each page carried a piece of the story, every detail a reflection of Brandon's betrayal. Walter picked up a photo first. Brandon and Amber, smiling as they left an upscale restaurant. In the next image, Brandon held Amber's hand tightly as they walked through a shopping center. Another showed them on a balcony at the Aspen Resort, the mountains behind them covered in snow. Walter's hands shook slightly as he laid them out in order. He took a deep breath and reached for the credit card statements. Line after line of transactions, each one more shocking than the last. Dinners, wine, spa services, designer clothing, a diamond necklace. All charged to the joint account he knew Michelle trusted implicitly. Walter's chest felt heavy. He ran a hand over his face, trying to calm the storm of emotions building inside him. Anger, betrayal, sadness. Each was sharper than the last. He paused, looking at a handwritten note Marcus had included from one of Brandon's co-workers. Brandon is practically dating Amber. Everyone knows, and he never talks about a wife. I honestly thought he was single. Walter swallowed hard. Even the people closest to Brandon at work had no idea about Michelle. The realization that Brandon had managed to live two entirely separate lives made his stomach churn. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a series of empty folders he had prepared over the past few days. He labeled each one carefully with a bold marker. 1. Brandon's workplace lies. 2. Proof of the affair. 3. Aspen vacation evidence. 4. Financial fraud. 5. Brandon's neglected mother. Walter began placing the documents in each folder, sorting the photos, receipts, and records so that everything was coherent and easy to follow. The process was meticulous and time-consuming, but Walter knew that organization was key. If Michelle was to truly understand the truth, she couldn't be confronted with chaos. She needed clarity. As he worked, his mind wandered to the conversation he would need to have. Michelle was strong, loyal, and loving, but Brandon had been the center of her world for years. He would need to be careful, strategic, and patient. Michelle might not believe me at first, he muttered aloud. She has to see this herself. He paused to pick up the Aspen vacation files, staring at the photos of Brandon and Amber on the balcony. The snow glistened behind them, but Walter only saw the lies layered over every smile. The San Diego conference Brandon had told Michelle about was a fabrication. The luxury trip to Aspen had cost thousands, all on Michelle's money. Next, he pulled the folder labeled financial fraud closer. Receipts for jewelry, fine dining, and shopping trips were neatly stacked. The numbers were glaring, $11,000 in total, including the $3,847 diamond necklace. Walter shook his head in disbelief, a quiet, hollow sound escaping him. He then picked up the folder on Brandon's neglected mother. Photos from the assisted living facility, bills paid only with Social Security, and Edith's own statements about never receiving Michelle's $25,000 painted a grim picture. Brandon had lied repeatedly about money, about care, about his intentions. Walter felt a pang of anger, so sharp it made his hands tremble. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. He's not just cheating, he's manipulating every part of her life, he whispered. He pulled up a chair and began drafting a plan in a small notebook. Michelle couldn't be ambushed with the information. The impact would be overwhelming, and she might reject it entirely if presented carelessly. Walter wrote down points, scenarios, questions he might ask her casually, ways to lead her toward understanding without causing a complete shock. He knew he couldn't just hand her the folders and expect her to accept the truth. She would need context, structure, and proof laid out logically. Walter paused and glanced at the proof of the affair folder again. Videos showing public displays of affection, dining, and shopping, all undeniable. Photos of the Aspen getaway, hotel records, flight tickets, restaurant receipts, all linked directly to Michelle's credit card. Everything told the same story. Brandon's betrayal was complete, calculated, and relentless. Walter leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to be methodical, patient, and precise. Michelle's love for Brandon might blind her initially, but the evidence would speak for itself. Each folder represented a chapter of the truth she needed to understand. Workplace lies to show the extent of his deception in public. Proof of the affair to remove any doubt of emotional betrayal. Aspen vacation evidence to expose the extravagant lies and secret trips. Financial fraud to reveal the misuse of her money. Neglected mother to demonstrate the cruelty and manipulation toward Edith. Walter exhaled slowly, letting the enormity of it sink in. The folders were ready. The evidence was complete. All that remained was to plan how to bring Michelle face to face with the truth. He knew she would resist at first. She loved Brandon, trusted him, and had built her life around him. But Walter also knew that Michelle was intelligent and fair-minded. If he could guide her to see the proof step by step. She would eventually understand. Walter picked up a pen and began writing down a schedule for presenting the evidence. The order mattered. He decided to begin with Brandon's workplace lies, then move through the affair, the Aspen trip, financial misdeeds, and finally end with the story of Edith's neglect. He wanted Michelle to grasp not only the emotional betrayal, but also the calculated manipulation behind it. Hours passed as Walter reviewed the documents, organized the photos, and arranged receipts in neat stacks. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence needed to be undeniable. By the time evening fell, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. Walter looked at the 5 folders lined neatly on the desk. Each one represented a part of the truth, a truth Michelle needed to see, whether she wanted to or not. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. Michelle's love for Brandon might blind her. Her trust might resist the reality he was about to reveal. But Walter knew one thing. She deserved the truth, no matter how painful. Walter carefully reviews the evidence, arranging it in 5 folders. 1. Brandon's workplace lies. 2. Proof of the affair. 3. Aspen trip evidence. 4. Financial fraud. 5. Brandon's abandoned mother. He knows Michelle still loves Brandon and might refuse to believe the truth. So he plans a careful way to reveal everything. Chapter 10. The trap is set. The week dragged on slowly for Walter. Each day felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge of Brandon's lies, the betrayal of his daughter, and the intricate web of deception that had been carefully woven over more than a year. The 5 folders of evidence lay neatly stacked on his dining table, each one meticulously prepared, ready to tell the story that Michelle needed to see. But Walter knew that evidence alone would not bring the truth to light. Michelle still loved Brandon. She still trusted him, despite the small seeds of doubt that had begun to sprout. No, Walter needed a way to bring both of them into the same space, a place where the story could unfold naturally, and where Brandon could no longer hide behind charm, excuses, or lies. Walter rubbed his temples, pacing slowly across the living room. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner echoed through the house. He had thought about it all day, turning every possible approach over in his mind. How could he ensure that both Michelle and Brandon would come without suspicion? How could he make sure that Michelle's heart remained open just enough to see the truth without shutting down completely? Then a thought struck him, a way to reach her emotionally. Walter picked up his phone and dialed Michelle's number. He waited, listening to the familiar ringing tone, and finally her voice came through. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart," Walter said warmly, keeping his voice steady. "How are you today?" "I'm okay," Michelle replied, though Walter could hear a hint of hesitation. "You didn't call all week. Everything okay?" Walter smiled softly, a plan forming. "Yes, everything is fine. Actually, I found something today, something I think you'll want to see." Michelle's curiosity immediately sparked. "What is it?" Walter spoke gently, choosing his words carefully. "Do you remember your mother's pearl necklace? The one she treasured? Well, I found it. I know how much it meant to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Michelle's voice softened. You found it?" "Yes," Walter said, trying to keep the excitement contained. "It's safe, and I'd like you to come over so I can show it to you. Maybe we can have dinner together this Saturday night. Just us, a small family dinner." Michelle hesitated. Their last interaction had been tense. The argument still hung in the air between them. I don't know, Dad. After everything." Walter's tone remained calm but insistent. "I understand, sweetheart. I really do. But this is something important. Your mother would have wanted you to have it. Please come. I promise it will be simple, just dinner, and then you can take the necklace home." Michelle's voice softened further, touched by the mention of her mother. "Okay, I'll come." "Great," Walter said warmly. "Bring Brandon too. I want us all to have dinner together." There was a slight pause. "All right, Dad. We'll come." Walter ended the call and set the phone down slowly. He took a deep breath and glanced at the 5 folders lined neatly on the dining table. Brandon's workplace lies, proof of the affair, Aspen vacation evidence, financial fraud, and Brandon's neglected mother. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Walter cleaned the house meticulously, arranging the dining room with care. The table was set with the finest china he owned, each utensil placed just so. Candles were positioned in the center, not just for atmosphere, but to create a sense of normalcy, a peaceful domestic setting that would contrast sharply with the confrontation to come. Walter cooked carefully, preparing Michelle's favorite dishes, roasted chicken with herbs, garlic mashed potatoes, and her mother's signature green bean casserole. The familiar smells of the kitchen, the gentle hum of music in the background, it all contributed to the illusion of a quiet, loving family dinner. By Friday evening, Walter reviewed the plan once more. Timing, presentation, and emotional impact were everything. He would wait until Brandon was seated, until Michelle was focused on the table, and the conversation felt safe. Then he would reveal the first folder, Brandon's workplace lies, to slowly guide Michelle through the truth. Walter felt a shiver of anticipation. This was not just a revelation, it was a reckoning. Brandon had carefully hidden his life for over a year, maintaining two identities, manipulating everyone around him, and even misappropriating Michelle's money. Tonight, there would be nowhere to hide. Saturday arrived. Walter rose early, checking the house from top to bottom. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in natural light. Candles were polished. The folders were placed on a side table, ready to be brought to the dining room at the precise moment. Around 5:30, the doorbell rang. Walter's heart skipped a beat. He smoothed his jacket, took a slow, steadying breath, and walked to the door. Michelle and Brandon stood there, smiling politely, both carrying an air of cautious optimism. Michelle looked genuinely pleased to see her father, her eyes lighting up at the mention of her mother's pearl necklace. Brandon, on the other hand, maintained his usual composed expression, unaware of the storm awaiting him. "Hi, Dad," Michelle said warmly, stepping inside. "Hi, sweetheart," Walter replied, smiling. "It's good to see you." Brandon followed her in, offering a polite nod. "Evening, Mr. Green." Walter returned the nod. "Evening, Brandon. I'm glad you could join us. I've prepared something special for dinner." As they moved into the dining room, the aroma of the freshly cooked food greeted them. The table looked inviting, the lighting warm and comforting. Michelle's gaze lingered on the center of the table. "It smells amazing, Dad." "Thank you," Walter said softly. "I thought we could have a nice, quiet dinner tonight, just like family." Brandon nodded, still unaware. "Sound great." Walter led them to their seats, maintaining a calm and measured tone. Everything was set. Everything was perfect. He looked over at Michelle, who still seemed focused on the idea of her mother's necklace. Then, in his mind, he reviewed the folders once more. Each one was a carefully constructed step, a revelation that would unfold logically and painfully for Brandon, and inevitably for Michelle too. The evening would not end with polite smiles or light conversation. No, tonight would reveal the full scope of Brandon's lies. Walter placed the first folder within reach, his hand resting on it briefly, almost as if he were drawing energy from the proof it contained. Inside the house, the 5 folders of evidence were waiting. Walter knew, without a doubt, that by the end of the night, Brandon's entire double life would be exposed, and Michelle would finally see the truth. The stage was set for the final confrontation.